Good afternoon. My name is Roger Davis. I'm a professor of Latin American history at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Welcome to our Brown Bag History Lecture Series, sponsored by the History Department of the University of Nebraska at Kearney. The series is offered in partnership with History Nebraska, the new public face of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday in selected months at Kearney Public Library. A schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the History Department programs, can be found at www.unke.edu, Academics History. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not already a member of History Nebraska, I certainly encourage you to join. It's a good and solid investment. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the UNK History Department and the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs. If you would like to watch any of the more than 180 previous Brown Bag lectures, visit History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska. Look for the playlists, and there you'll see a subscription labeled Brown Bag Lectures. Our speaker today is Mr. Cole Kruger. Mr. Kruger is serving as a lecturer at the University of Nebraska at Kearney and is a doctoral candidate in United States history at Kansas State University. His research interests have focused on World War II prisoners of war, an examination of their labor utilization throughout the United States, highlighting mutually beneficial relationships, labor strife, racial tensions, and potential violations of the Geneva Convention of 1929. His presentation today focuses upon the prisoner of war experience in Nebraska. Please wait until the end of the program for questions, if you would. So now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Cole Kruger.
Thank you everyone for coming today. I'm happy to be here, and I'll just get started. Today's topic, the enemy on the home front, Nebraska's World War II prisoner of war camps. During World War II, the demand for soldiers and created labor shortages throughout the United States. At the same time, thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war from North African campaigns began settling into prisoner life in the United States. To make the best of the labor pinch, the War Department allowed for the use of prisoners of war on the home front to fill the labor shortages. Nebraska is one such state to receive these POWs. Nebraska, one of the many states facing labor shortages, developed base camps in Scottsbluff, Indianola, Atlanta, and at Fort Robinson. Over 12,000 German and Italian prisoners of war in Nebraska filled the labor voids for a number of different jobs throughout the state, primarily in agriculture. The symbiotic relationship benefited all parties involved, as POWs showed Nebraskans the difference between Germans and Nazis. By 1944, Nebraska surpassed its previous records in crop production, and the prisoners earned wages for their work. POWs also received education opportunities in English, American history, and democracy while at the camps. Aided by the education they received in Nebraska's POW camps and relationships developed while working, many former prisoners returned to the United States years after World War II. In presenting this topic, Nebraska POWs, I will be highlighting the work of Thomas Negley here. He was a German Jewish immigrant to the United States who served as a POW guard at Camps Indianola and Camp Atlanta. So a lot of the paintings that you'll see are housed at Nebraska Prairie Life Museum in Holdridge, Nebraska, on display. And a lot of these prominent works cover images such as this beautiful artwork, description of camp life, provide a look into the day-to-day activities as Camp Indianola, and from things as mundane as a line of 18 toilets in the sanitary facilities. He has a humorous spin on a lot of events, throwing mutual relationships with the laboring population and so forth, but beautiful pictures indeed. So if you see the artwork, it's Thomas Negley, and I was fortunate enough to meet him in the time period there. POWs, how they got here is the question, the first POWs coming from Tunisia, Africa, end up in Nebraska. After several successful campaigns in North Africa by Great Britain and the United States, problems arose over the internment of enemy POWs in Nebraska in the spring of 1942 in Africa. After several successful campaigns in 1942 by the British, they now had hundreds of thousands of POWs being held in POW camps, as you can see here, that became quickly overcrowded. Because they could work in areas of mass unskilled labor to fill labor shortages and voids in the countryside, working in forest conservation, agricultural regions, and construction needs on railroads and airfields, ultimately the United States agreed to take in all of the POWs under two conditions. Great Britain had to give at least a 1-month notice before each shipment of POWs, and secondly, the British would pledge to provide all necessary transportation for their repatriation. The British government agreed promptly. Throughout the United States, they're still coming up and turning over many camps that were put in place. There was 511 different camps that served over 425,000 different Italian, German, and some lesser Japanese POWs in the United States during World War II. As you can see there, Nebraska is not alone in garnering these POW camps, but they became a vital part of the war effort. During World War II, the 4 prisoner of war camps based in Nebraska that held 12,000 German, Italian POWs, over 20,000 different POWs in their time period in Nebraska. The state provided an ideal location for POW camps and met the requirements for a wide open space, far from the coastlines and borders with relatively low civilian population. Additionally, these POW camps were located away from Nebraska's few wartime industries, but then as we'll see, they start creeping closer and closer to the wartime industries and so forth. Here, the ideal location for these first initial POW camps was at military installations already in place, and so places like Nebraska's Fort Robinson exemplified the initial plans by the War Department to expedite development of POW camps at these military stations. Fort Robinson, one of the country's largest remount facilities, provided a place for training of thousands of horses, mules, and eventually canines for military operations prior to and during World War II. Since the designers of Fort Robinson's POW camp conceptualized it as a military project at a military post, they divulged very little information of the camp's happenings to the local citizens. Other military installations that got soon to have POWs on them, one would be in Scottsbluff. In an attempt to stimulate the local economy, the city of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, lobbied for the development of military installation. In pursuit of this goal, and in the spirit of aiding in the war effort, the town offered the government a chance to lease the Scottsbluff Municipal Airport for $1, giving the War Department the privileges to destroy or construct anything at the site. The War Department could not forgo such an opportunity. However, the airstrip proved insufficient for the Army's needs, so the construction began immediately on the development of the new airfield. The construction exceeded over $5.5 million. To minimize the cost, they decided to build a POW camp at the old municipal airstrip. So you have POWs there. At Camp Atlanta and Camp Indianola, the camps were built for different purposes to help in agricultural labor shortages. Here at Camp Atlanta, by March 1943, members of the Holger area faced a severe shortage of labor and wrote to Nebraskan senators and congressmen asking for a conscientious objector camp to be set up in the area to help in the labor shortage and the state's labor crisis. The conscientious objector camps developed formed alternative civil service for individuals who claimed the right to refuse the draft or military service on the grounds of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Soon after the Joint Committee's appeal Army engineers from Carmody Army Airfield surveyed the land around Holdridge, Nebraska. They eventually settled on a piece of land 5 miles southwest of Holdridge, near the small town of Atlanta. The Holdridge Committee felt they had succeeded in bringing conscientious objector camp to the area, but they were quite surprised when they found out that it was going to be POWs from North Africa arriving in their hometowns. Here, similarly, Camp Indianola was built as a sister camp to Camp Atlanta in its functions, separated by only 50 miles. Camp Atlanta and Camp Indianola were served by the same engineers out of the Kearney Airfield. Both began construction June of 1943 and were activated late October within days of each other. Here, camps built similarly, holding nearly 3,000 POWs in each of them, but they differed how they purposes for development. Camp Atlanta developed to alleviate labor shortages in agriculture. Camp Indianola was to help with the government's irrigation and flood control projects in the Republican River Valley, but soon they also were helping in agricultural purposes as well. Here, later on in the war, Camp Indianola served a different purpose, which involved the housing of pro-Nazi non-commissioned officers. In July 1944, the War Department issued a segregation program for all POWs in an attempt to separate the Nazi and anti-Nazi prisoners, especially those who had climbed to the leadership positions in the POW camps themselves. The ardent Nazis in camps across the nation often harassed and disciplined anti-Nazi Germans, which in some cases led to death. Nebraska's first POWs, although most of the POWs in the country were German, Nebraska's first were actually Italian. Camp Scottsbluff's Italian POWs were also Nebraska's first POWs. The Italian POWs were most of whom belonged to one of Italy's elite marksman units, often differed from their German POW counterparts. Italians tended to be more carefree, lackadaisical, while the German POWs earned the reputation of being stoic, well-mannered, and hard workers. As a boy, Herb Hinman lived across the road from Camp Scottsbluff. Remember the Italians arriving at the camp stating, "They seemed to be happy, some whistling or singing as they walked along like they were going for a stroll. They would even wave, speak out as they went by until the guards spoke to them." The often charismatic Italian POWs made lasting impressions on many Nebraskan citizens through their interactions created by the labor program. On September 8, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allied forces and then declared war against Germany, which further complicates the situation. This created a problem as Italians at Camp Scottsbluff throughout the nation went from prisoners of war to allies overnight that are being held in prisons. And so the War Department decided to continue interning the Italian POWs under the Geneva Convention, as not all POWs showed anti-fascist tendencies. The government, however, developed a parole program for Italian POWs who demonstrated loyalty to the United States. Eventually, the government created the Italian service units for the Italians who passed the screening process necessary to serve as part of the United States military and non-combatant labor roles. So from overnight, one day, they're POWs held behind prison. Now they're dressed in American GI uniforms, but still held in prisons. And the reason for this is the labor that they will be doing at these camps. One of Camp Scottsbluff's fascist Italian POWs, they ran into some problems with a lot of Italians trying to join the Italian service unit and so forth. The more ardent pro-fascist ones, Ferruccio Piccolo wrote a letter that he distributed amongst other POWs, encouraging them to stay out of the ISU and remain loyal to the Italian cause. This letter stated, "Perhaps the attempts to bend us have not yet been ended. We must remain intractable. Even should we be detached or separated, we promise ourselves to our friends and to our companions that we shall not yield. Courage and decision, dear comrades, long live Italy." As a result, these pro-fascist tendencies and threats against other POWs, these pro-fascist POWs were eventually separated out of Camp Scottsbluff and sent to camps in Texas, Camp Hearn in Texas, to attempt to segregate the fascist Italian POWs. This transfer led to hundreds of POWs at Camp Scottsbluff joining the ISU. The ISU members received special training and underwent continuous screening process. And on May 1st, 1944, The 70th Italian Quartermaster Service Company was formed from former POWs at Camp Bluff. The 70th ISU primarily worked at Sioux Ordnance Depot near Sidney, Nebraska, where they served as laborers, engineers, carpenters, auto mechanics, typists, tractor operators, hospital attendants, and cooks. These men were issued American GI uniforms and had special privileges allowing them to come and go from the camp as they pleased. But when in town, they had to be escorted by an officer. The War Department deemed the ISU program highly successful, and the Italian Service Union nationwide performed over 6 million man-days of labor on United States military installations throughout the country, serving on depots, ports, all throughout the country. But the big question is, how did everyone feel about having the enemy on the home front, primarily most being the Germans? The news of the War Department building POWs camps in Nebraska shocked many of its residents. The thought of enemy on the home front in Nebraska arose concerns from locals who had misaligned thoughts on Germans and Italians. Propaganda by the War Department's propaganda campaign had smeared the images of Germans and what their typical depictions were. The only thing that most Nebraskans knew about the enemy came from what they had heard or read after the fighting erupted. Oftentimes, writers, journalists, cartoonists, filmmakers, and radio broadcasters portrayed the Axis leaders and soldiers as purely evil, and they dehumanized them by depicting them as monsters or treacherous animals. Many Nebraskans could not concede the idea of these evil monsters being housed in the heartland under even the strictest security, but nothing could be done to stop the concentration of the camps. Here, as noted earlier, the War Department concluded that any POW camp throughout the country would meet resistance from the locals, so the safest and most useful areas would be chosen. Initial responses went as one might expect when POWs started arriving in the heartland. I would rather let my corn rot than employ German laborers, one Nebraska farmer exclaimed. After hearing Camp Indianola's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Whitten, announced that POWs were coming to Indianola and that they would be available for farm labor soon, the farmers' sentiment reflected the feelings of many Nebraskan farmers, despite being hard-pressed by labor shortages. Whitten launched an education campaign at the camp in an attempt to show Nebraskans the practicality, the benefits, and process for acquiring POW laborers. Whitten's campaign resulted in 10 reluctant farmers agreeing to use POWs as a trial labor force in the farms. Within the next couple weeks, Whitten had over 75 labor contracts on his desk to be signed wanting to use POW labor in their fields, thus validating his campaign to utilize POWs as an agricultural labor force. Similar situations and resistance ensued throughout Nebraska's first labor programs. Many farmers feared using POW labor for a number of reasons, including safety concerns, possible scrutiny, and claims of being unpatriotic for employing the nation's enemy. Eventually, perhaps out of desperation or enlightenment, Nebraskans began to use the POW labor, dispelling previous reservations about the prisoners. The POWs proved themselves as a viable option in combating Nebraska's labor shortages. Initially, a lot of the labor positions filled would be at the camps themselves. In each of Nebraska's 4 POW-based camps, the primary objective was to become as self-sufficient as possible. The War Department wanted to optimize POW labor to free up GIs for overseas duty. The desire for self-sufficiency went as far as having the camps grow their own crops in an attempt to minimize the cost of the camp. In most cases, first prisoners at the camps helped finish construction on the camps themselves. Those would be the first POWs sent in. Here, if an enlisted POW refused to work, he would be reprimanded and placed under supervised confinement on minimal rations of just bread and water. Nebraska's camp commanders happily enforced these orders, and in most cases, the belligerent POWs returned to work only after a couple days of confinement. POWs found that working helped pass the time, and they were also eager to engage in work outside the camp. POWs filled skilled labor positions at the camp by utilizing the various skills in carpentry, typing, translating, auto mechanics, design, farming, Here, some of the farmers even had built their own victory garden at Camp Atlanta and so forth that became so prosperous that they had an overabundance of vegetables, and they helped supply the neighboring military airfields and depots throughout the state. Prisoners took pride in keeping their facilities spotless, as they preferred newly built barracks and latrines to the temporary camps in Africa that we had just seen. Additionally, the POWs took over position as the kitchen cooks, primarily because they did not care for American bread and preferred the thicker crusted breads. Camp officials also explained that they wanted more spaghetti served, sometimes as often as 3 times a day. They ensured they would not tire of it. That was the Italians at Camp Scottsbluff, if you couldn't tell who was protesting that one. Fort Robinson Remount Station. Fort Robinson, Quartermaster Depot, and Remount Station required a larger labor force than most places. The thousands of horses, mules, and dogs trained at Fort Robinson required a lot of maintenance and personal attention. The labor done by the Fort Robinson POWs consisted of work outside the camp as camp walls at the Fort Remount Station and Dog Training Center, including jobs as loading lumber, hauling gravel, cleaning horse stalls, dog kennels, and working on feed bunkers, hauling manure, working in the dairy barn, handling rations, and working at the veterinary clinic itself. With such large amounts of labor undertaken by the POWs, this freed up additional U.S. military personnel for wartime duties. A Thomas Negley painting here. Sunrise at the main gate. Unlike Camp Scottsbluff, Fort Robinson, and even Fort Crook, which were constructed to aid military stations, Camps Atlanta and Indianola were built to combat civilian labor shortages, primarily in agriculture. Even with January arrival, some POW labor saved the crop from one of Nebraska farmer Bernard Modrell of Palisade, still had the corn crop of 1943 in the fields of January 1944 because of lack of labor. Modrell contracted POW labor from Camp Indianola and saved his crop. By the summer of 1944, the use of POW labor in agriculture was in full swing at Nebraska's 3 base camps, Camps in Atlanta, Indianola, and Scottsbluff, while Fort Robinson continued to deploy most of its POWs on the base itself. Nearly every enlisted POW not involved in work at the camps labored in the agricultural realm. As you can see here in another Thomas Negley painting, this is Hoeing Beets, is the title of this one. As you can see them working in the fields side by side here, typically guards taking them out, had to be transported usually by the farmers themselves in makeshift trucks and so forth. For a farmer to secure POW labor, he needed to give a 24-hour notice to the POW camp and receive permission from the War Manpower Commission. After appropriate approval, the farmer went to the camp at 6 a.m., paid the labor officers for his POW's labors at the wage rate determined by the county labor board, and transported the POWs and their guard to the work site themselves. In return for this, the POWs earned 80 cents a day in Canteen Script for their labor. They never received hard currency, as it may help them in escaping, so it would all be through Canteen Script that they can buy newspapers and other accessories at the canteen store. The Tri-County Labor Board set the wage rate for Phelps, Kearney, and Gosper counties at 50 cents per POW per hour for common labor that a farmer would have to pay to use each POW, such as throwing hay, would incur a 60 cents for specialized labor, such as detasseling and shelling corn, while the POWs received 80 cents a day in Canteen Script. The farmers actually had to pay much more to help, with the cost of maintaining the camp. In addition, the worksite could be no further than 1 hour away from the camps. After a few months, it became a daily routine to see backs of trucks filled with POWs on their way to work. Here, the wartime rationing also hurt the farmers in the extent that they could bring POWs. They couldn't take them 1 hour away. Also, speed limit restrictions of 35 miles per hour, limiting the use of tires and gasoline for rationing purposes during World War II, eliminated this problem. Here, to combat these issues, the War Department decided to develop temporary POW branch camps, also known as satellite camps. This allowed for POWs to be in the areas of necessity while still conserving resources. Here, the Nebraska POW branch camp, and I'm sure I've missed some, and the growing list continues. They were temporary sites. Camp Atlanta, with its central Nebraska location, supported the most POW branch camps. Grand Island, Hastings, Kearney, Franklin, Hebron, Weeping Water, Elwood, Bertrand, Alma, Lexington, Palisade, Hayes Center, Ogallala, Binkleman, Hall County, Cornhusker Division, Camp Indianola, and 2 camps in Kansas at Hayes and Cocker City. Camp Scottsbluff supported 6 branch camps: Bridgeport, Bayard, Lehman, Watt, Mitchell, Morrill, and Sidney. Most of these Italian prisoners worked at the Sioux Ordnance Depot outside of Sidney. Camp Scottsbluff and corresponding branch camps housed German POWs for agricultural labor. Additionally, Camp Scottsbluff spawned 4 POW camps in Wyoming as well. Fort Robinson eventually utilized its POWs for agricultural labor and developed 2 branch camps in South Dakota. As you can see here, when you put them all on the map and the density in the regions of where these satellite camps are and so forth, it's quite widespread. Yes, I include the South Dakota, Wyoming, and Kansas ones. Those were under the control of the base camps that Nebraska held. Other places that POWs worked, although typically working in agriculture, some of the branch camps had other unique assignments, one such being outside of Grand Island. German POWs from the Hall County Cornhusker branch camp worked construction at the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant. The Cornhusker Labor Detachment was located near the Cornhusker Army Ammunition Plant outside of Grand Island, Nebraska. Despite inspection by delegate of International Red Cross Committee of Geneva, the German POWs worked for the construction companies tasked with building a 4th load line for the assembly of bombs and mortar shells at the ordnance plant. The POW camp was built to combat the labor shortages at the plant. The use of POW labor at the plant, however, neglected the provisions of the Geneva Convention of 1929. Construction work on the military installations, such as the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant, was in direct connection to wartime industries, prohibited by Article 31 of the Geneva Convention, which stated, "Work done by prisoners of war shall have no direct connection with operations of the war." Here they are assembling a line and working as construction workers on assembling a 4th line at the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant. Here, the German POWs eventually protested the labor after realizing what they were doing for the Allied war effort. A former POW at the Ordnance Plant, Sebastian Yocher, here recalled the instigation of the strike in December of 1944. As he says, "Actually, it was very simple and came from my own actions. Because we were sitting there in a camp, the guy asked me, he was writing a letter home, and he said to me, 'What should I write? What I work for? What am I doing here in America?' I said, 'Write that you are working for an eraser company.' 'Eraser?' he asked. 'Yeah, an eraser company to wipe out German cities.' Almost immediately, a protest arose. The POWs always knew where they worked at the COP and what the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant did, but Yocher's joke created a frenzy at the branch camp, and noted that some POWs felt the U.S. treated the POWs fairly and fed well, and they should just continue working. Others, nevertheless, remained adamant in protest. The adamant event ended when the POWs were taken to a German church in Grand Island for Christmas. At this church, a priest smoothed over things, and the next day, everyone returned to work. Here, camp strikes, when they would happen, again, the rations would be reduced to bread and water, and this usually mitigated the strikes. In this instance, they went to church in Grand Island, and everyone continued back to work quite quickly. Here, for the most part, there was a good working relationship between the Nebraska's Germans and Italians working here. Cultural differences and slanderous stereotypes propagated by both German and American governments left a weariness and distrust during many of the first POWs in Nebraska civilian encounters. These concerns soon dissolved as POWs began working alongside Nebraskans. As prisoners entered the agricultural labor force, a learning curve took place for both POWs and Nebraskans. Many of the German prisoners came from large cities and never did any farm labor before. Here, a language barrier further complicated things. Nebraskan farmers, weary of the enemy laborers, learned how to maximize the inexperienced POWs' labors while ensuring everyone's safety. An attempt To teach POWs farm practice, Camp Scottsbluff translated pamphlets containing pictures and instructions on how to work with sugar beets and distributed them to POWs. At Camp Indianola, officers or group leaders would be given the instruction on how to pick corn, which they in turn demonstrated to the other POWs. They started using other officers in the labor task to lead the POW workers. Here, some desperate Nebraska farmers who needed their crops harvested promptly bribe the POW workers with home-cooked food or sometimes even pay incentives. One German POW recalled one instance of a farmer outside of Scottsbluff feeding his workers a large lunch. One farmer didn't think we were being fed enough to work all day the way that we did, so he brought us a big lunch every day. We told him that it wasn't allowed, but he said, "Let them bring 100 officers. I only fear God." Here, Bill and Marge Richards devised another incentive for the POWs working on their farm just south of Holdridge. He noted that in the beginning, each POW laborer produced about 26 bushels of corn per day. After the Richards decided to give the POWs incentive pay of 10 cents per bushel in Canteen Script, each POW then picked over 50 bushels a day. The incentive works. The labor program served multiple purposes, benefiting all parties involved. Nebraska alleviated its labor constraints with POW labor. The camps maximized efficiency by employing POWs, which helped relieve U.S. troops for overseas duties. But you can only work for so long. You can only, by the Geneva Convention, work for an 8-hour day. So what to do with the rest of their time? Here, POWs found different ways to entertain themselves through artwork, writing letters, and so forth. Here, from our viewpoint, the camp commander at Camp Atlanta said, from our viewpoint, it would be advantageous to keep as many men occupied as possible as idle minds get into trouble. Thus, the government feared the boredom would lead to anger and turn into reprisals, strikes, midnight trials, escape attempts, and sabotage on U.S. industry. The obvious solution resided in the labor programs, but they had to fill the rest of the time. One other event, sports, primarily soccer here, became the first form of recreation Nebraska POWs engaged in. Days after internment at Camp Scottsbluff, the local newspapers noted Italian POWs vigorously and passionate playing soccer in the camp yard. This held true at all of Nebraska's base camps, as both Germans and Italians love soccer. The guards tried to teach them American football. It did not go so well. Holdridge citizens out for the Sunday evening joyride often stopped along Highway 6 in front of Camp Atlanta to watch the POW soccer games. Additionally, the POWs at Nebraska's camps played volleyball, baseball, handball, fistball. Italians at Camp Scottsbluff enjoyed Italian bowling or bocce ball. The camps typically purchased the sports equipment themselves, although they received donations from the YMCA and locals. Here at Fort Robinson, one such donation came in the nick of time. The Swiss Red Cross inspector arrived, much to the relief of the POWs, with a present of 2 first-class soccer balls in the nick of time for the camp's championship game. The POW athletic programs became prominent enough that base camps often squared off against one another, such as Camp Atlanta facing Camp Indianola. German POW Ernst Bartholomeus even recalled playing for Camp Indianola against the POW team interned at Fort Carson, Colorado. In addition, U.S. military personnel stationed at these camps formed their own baseball teams and competed against other military installations. Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot, the McCook and Harvard Army airfields would square off against Camps Indianola and Camps Atlanta's military personnel that are stationed there. Arts and crafts became another time filler, especially during the winter when little needed to be done. All the camps, Nebraska's camps, novice and professional artists tried their hand at painting the scenic Nebraska plains and their existence at the camps. Murals, cartoons, and sketches eventually filled the barracks. Also, another form of entertainment for POWs came from theater and musical performances and whatever is happening here. Lacking in evening endeavors, the camp officials allowed POWs to organize skits, plays, and concerts, maybe a skit. Orchestra at base camps formed and performed at the base camps and often made trips to the branch camps to entertain the POWs there as well. They took their performances very seriously. Elaborate sets, costumes coupled with POWs actors' commitment to the performance. When the plays necessitated female roles, POWs dressed in drag and donned makeup to complete the full cast to have their productions. Thomas Negley, a prisoner of war guard, artist at Camp Indianola and Camp Atlanta, depicted some of the interactions that occurred as POWs shopped for inexpensive theater equipment and musical instruments for the camp's productions. In one instance, Negley painted and recorded a trip to McCook pawn shop, fall of 1944. In the pawn shop, POW Panzer found a fiddle and began serenading a young GI and his girlfriend. On another shopping trip for stage curtains and costume attire for the upcoming show, the sales clerk and store manager mistook the German POWs for U.S. military personnel. Unbeknownst to the store manager, assured the POWs that it was delighted to be of service of our boys in the armed forces. Negley recalled that these rare trips excited the POWs just for a moment and made them feel like regular civilians once again. The German POWs at Camp Scottsbluff formed a brass band and an orchestra led by POW, formerly the first chair violinist of the famed and over 100-year-old Vienna Philharmonic. And so they also had some quite talented musicians in these camps. Additionally, newspapers began to be produced under careful watch from the guards at every camp. Furthermore, Nebraska POW camps received the newspaper publication Der Ruf. The German newspaper Der Ruf, or The Call, was written by POWs for POWs under the strictest of supervision from American military officers. The intent with this paper was to be circulated this publication nationally to the POW camps because of its anti-Nazi lean and pro-democratic discussions for post-war Germany. Many German POWs recognized the newspaper as propaganda, but its factual accuracy made it very popular, and it was something to read, of course. The War Department justified the education program by the vagueness of Article 17 of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which stated, "So far as possible, belligerents shall encourage intellectual diversions and sports organized by prisoners of war." And so in this way, they started to produce these papers. From this, the United States found its name for its recreation and educational programs that they start to establish, the Intellectual Diversion Program. Prior to the Intellectual Diversion Program, the International Red Cross, Germany provided POWs with books, pamphlets, calendars filled with Nazi teachings, ideology, and propaganda. So to combat this, the War Department censored and developed its own curriculum and created the Special Projects Division. The Special Projects Division reviewed and prepared films, books, radio broadcasts for POWs, translated surveys, texts, gathered intelligence on all the POW camp newspapers, and hired prisoners to help insert in curriculum and write the newspaper Der Ruf. Here, all Nebraska's camps implemented classes for SPD's curriculum offered, classes for POWs, some even to finish high school and prepare for university examination. The night school allowed for varying subjects such as business, trade, music theory, German literature, along with enabling POWs who worked during the day to be involved as well. Subjects of the classes included English, history, geography, Latin, German, physics, math, biology, French, and athletics, and eventually courses on democracy and American history. As Special Projects Division Officer Maxwell McKnight at Fort Robinson describes, "We got all the books banned in Germany and distributed them in the camps, and in the camps where they weren't burned by the Nazis, they were a real breakthrough. Because all the years of the Nazis and their thought control over it were over, it was like opening a floodgate to nurse a Sahara." Despite all these seemingly good things at the camps and the good relationships that they have with Nebraska, there were POW escape attempts. Nebraska's centralized location away from the international borders did not deter all prisoners from attempting to escape. In fact, all Nebraska POW camps reported escapes. Most of Nebraska's escapes from the ardent Nazi POWs housed at Camp Indianola. Most of Nebraska's escape attempts ended in prompt seizures as guards and authorities captured the POWs within miles of the camps. Even those who did not cover great distances rose suspicion if they did not speak English fluently. The most successful escapees from Nebraska, however, escaped from Camp Scottsbluff. 2 German POWs, Sergeant Wolfgang Kruger and Corporal Karl Tomola, made their way to Canada because of their English abilities. They worked in Canada for a while under new identities before they decided to return to Philadelphia to board a ship for Europe, and this is where their identities fell through, and they were promptly seizured. At Camp Indianola, a POW escaped from the camp and made his way to North Platte Union Pacific Railroad Station. This vital wartime railroad junction was under armed guard. The prisoner strolled into the rail yard, and after failing to stop on order, the railroad guard shot and killed the POW. They returned the body to Camp Indianola for proper burial. As the particular escape attempt ended fatally, some Nebraska escapees resulted in humor. At Camp Atlanta, after the POWs returned from working one day, they lined up for count as usual. The camp officials realized that a POW was missing. The guards sprung into action and began searching the camp everywhere for the missing POW. Later that night, they heard shouts at the front gate. They go off and leave me, was being yelled at the sentry on duty. Further investigation revealed the POW stepped behind a tree to relieve himself at the farm where they had been working while everyone else loaded into the truck, and by the time he finished, the truck had left. Lenient guards and relationships with civilians led to this mutually beneficial. Civilians took their note from how the guards began to treat the POWs. In this instance, Thomas Negley here painting. They're on a scrap run to McCook to seize the scrap yard, and as you can see, the POW in there is enjoying his first ice cream cone in several years. A.J. Williams remarked about his experiences with battalion POWs and guards who worked on his family's farm, only 8 at the time. Williams heard gunshots on his way home from school and thought a POW must have tried to escape. Williams stated, "The guard, dad, and the POWs were celebrating the end of the potato harvest by using the guard's rifle to determine who was the best marksman. The targets were being extra sunburned potatoes." However, the government did not always agree with the interaction between POWs and citizens. Conversing with prisoners of war is rated felony, read the title of an article, The Grand Island Independent, July 1944. Nebraska's created citizens and large German immigrant population entice interaction between prisoners and civilians. Leo Stewart, a prominent and well-respected citizen in the community and future benefactor of the Steer Museum of the Prairie Pioneer in Grand Island, Nebraska, received a warning from the commanding officer of the Grand Island branch for ignoring regulations and socializing with POWs. Here, they had to ask him several times to stop meeting with POWs in the camp. He still refused to do this and then fretted one POW. Their friendship endured the war's end, and they corresponded with one another for years after the war and actually visited each other in Germany, and he came back over, visited them in Grand Island as well. The most famous example of POW working relations, William Oberdick here, and POW returned. William Oberdick, German POW at Camp Atlanta, worked at an apple orchard in Nebraska City and developed a strong friendship with its owner, Richard Kimmel. Through this friendship, Oberdick immigrated back to Nebraska and his wife, Adele, because Kimmel's sponsorship and relationship in 1950, and they became United States citizens in 1961. Oberdick returned to work at Kimmel's orchard and eventually bought it from Kimmel. Oberdick and Richard Kimmel remained good friends for the remainder of their lives, which was eventually donated to Arbor Day Foundation in Nebraska City. Others interactions with, and particularly in Grand Island here, hundreds of lovers traversed the Atlantic Ocean to maintain relations and plan trips after the war and so forth. Quandt family of German descent openly spoke German with POW here, Hartman, while he labored on their farms, despite potentially being seen as unpatriotic. The Quandts tried to be as kind as possible to the POWs, often serving the POW guests and guards lavish lunches. For Hartman's 21st birthday here, they even baked him a cake. Reinhardt justified his fair treatment of stating, "We had American prisoners of war in Germany, just as they had German prisoners of war here. We would have liked the Germans to treat our boys like humans, so we treated prisoners we had like they were human beings." After Japan's official surrender on September 2nd, 1945, World War II ended at Nebraska's POW camps. Most of the prisoners remained in the camps for the fall harvest of 1945. As the harvest wound down, returning U.S. soldiers began to fill the labor shortages throughout the state as positions for POWs decreased, attendance in education classes increased, and prisoners began to forge materials for building suitcases. Nebraska's POW camps also began to downsize and deactivate. Here, by 1946, not a single POW remained in the state. Without any POWs, the final question for the government involved what to do with the camps and the hundreds of buildings built on them. Here, what they decided to do is auction them off. Here, with the lack of resources during the war, used for the war effort and rationing, there wasn't supplies like plumbing, wiring that were available, so useful commodities at the time were found in these buildings. Nebraskans utilized the buildings for a variety of different purposes, including homes, hotels, grain bins, clubhouses, American Legion halls, student housing, Nebraska Teachers College, today's University of Nebraska at Kearney, used a couple of the former barracks as emergency housing for veteran students. 7 buildings were also sent to Republican City to be used in the dam building and flood projects going on there. Today, the only remaining remnants of Nebraska's POW camps are the piles of rubble, the outlines of building foundations, a couple chimney stacks, water towers, and a few surviving relocated buildings. But from the efforts of Nebraskan scholars, curators, artists, POWs themselves, Nebraskans reaching out, they will never be forgotten. Here, I want to give a special thanks to Nebraska State Historical Society, University of Nebraska Kearney, the Kearney Public Library, Thomas Negley, the Prairie of Plains Museum, Steer Museum of the Prairie Life, Legacy of the Plains Museum, and Fort Robinson Museum and History Center, where I got most of this photos and stuff from for this presentation. I was lucky enough and fortunate enough, Thomas Negley lived a long enough life that even me, and I wish I would have wore a better shirt that day, was able to actually meet him at Nebraska's Plains Museum. And it's incredible what they have out there, so make sure you go out and see these beautiful artworks. That's all I had. Thank you very much. I believe we're going to have a questions and answer section here. Feel free to come up and talk.
Just a couple comments. One is, when the war was over, how many of those POWs returned back to the United States?
That is a great question, and so many people have tried. I have tried for years to find that information, and nobody knows because the census records stopped. Most of the archives on POWs was sent in St. Louis, or the records themselves were actually sent back to Germany, and you have to go to Berlin to access them on who the POWs were and where they were and so forth percent there. But for the repatriation and so forth, I can confidently say, a great number came back, 10, 20, 50. I would like to have more accurate information on that, but we only have glimpses of those coming back, and of course they don't always necessarily come back to Nebraska and so forth. I wish I had the statistic on it, and I would have said it if I did. And I've been looking for a long time period and trying to conduct my own research on it. It's very difficult.
Yeah, my 99-year-old mother just died, and she had made the statement, because, again, my ancestors came from Germany, of course, so she was interested. But she made the comment that it was not uncommon, and I knew a guy, not that it matters, but I was born in Hebron, and so a block and a half away from our house is where the camp was.
Yep.
And just to show you now, I taught history for 40 years, taught at Kearney State, political assassination class 30 years ago. But shows you how naive we are. When I was a young kid growing up, the camp, or as I call it, the CCC camp, the concentration,
former CCC camp.
as I called it, the concentration camp, because the letter CCC to me at age 10 meant concentration camp. And I knew there were Germans in those buildings, and so I and all my friends thought, which I thought was kind of interesting when you were talking, because we saw them as, we saw no delineation between that and a concentration camp. Now, obviously, we're talking about the age here, because it was a CCC camp where they located
Yep.
the POWs.
They just reused an old CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Hebron and other different
Yes.
locations, and then just started rebuilding them and putting POWs in
Yes,
there.
and so we'd ride our go-karts around the buildings and whatnot, and there's still one there. But anyway, back to another point. Hebron would be, where are you from? Are you in Nebraska?
I'm from Grand Island, Nebraska.
Okay, so
Yep.
where Geneva is, you go south, 25 miles
Yep.
where Hebron is. And my mother said that many of those POWs would go all the way to like Falls City, Nebraska City, pick apples, which is far more than an hour away. So when you made that comment, I was kind of interested in that. So I said they'd go all the way to Falls City in those days. I mean, how long a drive is that back in those days? So yeah, they'd bring back apples and give them to the local people.
Yep, that was working in the apple orchards around there was a big one. I'm sure they built branch camps much closer, but they
Yeah.
might have, in a labor pinch, had to travel long distances.
And then everything I was kind of intrigued by, I again remember growing up, because again the letters confused me, CC camp, and so that's how your brain works. And I remember asking my mother, my dad, by the way, was at Pearl Harbor during World War II, so it was kind of the two opposites here. But I said, where are the fences at? Because, I mean, if you're locking up POWs, isn't there a fence? And my mother said, there's not a fence here. There's no fence. I went, now, is that correct? Were there not fences on all these camps?
How rapidly and how temporary a lot of these places were, they would not have fences, or they would just have posted guards outside of them when they would take typically trusted POWs out to those situations. But yeah, they would use former schools. There's talks of them using abandoned buildings that they just repurposed for a week or so and built a camp there overnight. And sometimes would put barbed wire on the windows, and that's about it.
Yeah, it just shocked me, because you picture one thing in your mind when you grow up. But then I said, well, who kept them in there? How they keep,
Usually one guard.
yeah, how they keep from running
They'd
away?
like to have one guard per 5 POWs, but it usually went to like about 20 per guard, and there's even instances where they stopped sending guards with some
Yeah.
of them.
And she said, well, they would calmly walk around town. I go, what do you mean? Because
Yeah.
again, to me, a German was a Nazi. Again, at that
Yep,
age,
that was
those are the same thing.
what they were.
And so
learning.
I go, what, weren't people afraid of him? She goes, no, they weren't afraid of him. As a matter of fact, the Lutheran church that I grew up in, the altar and the lights were quite intricate the way they were made. So those were all made by POWs back.
Yep. Yeah, the
back
art is
warriors.
another aspect I'm working on. I love the POW art, as I showed a few images there. It's another fascinating aspect of it. Thank you for that.
I grew up in the Bertrand area. I did not realize that there was a satellite in Bertrand.
Yep.
Do you know where it was?
I'm not sure. I would have to look into the specifics of it, but I could find that for you. But they oftentimes, like I said, they were so temporary and quick. In the Bertrand one, it may have lasted 3 weeks or a month or just for a harvest, and then it was gone. And then maybe they'd come back there the next year and so forth. They weren't really confined, fixed areas, but it might have been in a building available or something like that.
Well, not to reveal my age too much, but my classmate's father had POWs with his farming operation.
Yep.
And they talked about how they came in and sat at the table and ate with the family.
Yep, which they weren't
And-
supposed to do, and it happened
and
almost everywhere.
They were a German family, so they understood German food a little bit. But the German prisoners drew the line at roasting ears. They would not eat corn on the cob
Oh, really?
because
I
that
didn't know
was
that.
that was food for pigs.
That's right. Yeah? Well,
I want to follow up with a comment that she reminded me of it. The rules and regulations about them, the government regulations are one thing, the real world is another. That's what my mother would say is they commonly would eat with the local farmers and whatnot, and they would be out on their own. But recently down home, a guy by the name of, which initiated my first comment, his name was Gerd Cruz, not that matters again, but just a guy that I knew. He was a German POW. He, when the war was over, I assumed that they were all sent back to Germany and Italy.
well, they actually, in the repatriation process, most of them, unless they had there was an education program where they could go straight back to Germany. They usually had to serve in England and France and rebuilding those for a year or two. So oftentimes it wasn't until 1947 that a lot of them made it back to their homes if they still had them.
But were all of them sent back?
All of them were, yeah, except for one individual who escaped and remained on the run until 1985.
The guy I'm referencing.
But all but one. Yeah, it's a famous example of
Because
Gardner.
Gerd was sent back to Germany.
Yep.
And how long he was there, I mean, I wouldn't know. But he eventually came back to his little town of Deschler, south of Geneva. Came back to Deschler because when he was out working for the farmers, here we go again, he got to know the daughter, I guess, pretty well. But went back to Germany, came back, and so all the time I knew him, I mean, he still, of course, you could tell he had a heavy German accent, but he came back and he married the daughter, and Gerd lived there all the time that we ever knew him. So that's what initiated my first question about, was that a common thing for him? Because I knew that guy that came back.
Not common, but it did happen quite frequently. And there's other instances at Scottsbluff with the Italian Service Union members in the GI uniforms having relations with local women. One famous instance, they actually ended up getting married. He had to be repatriated back to Italy first, and then she flew over there, and then they got married, and then came back to settle in Colorado and set up a mechanic shop.
I don't know what the relationship was.
Yeah.
But somehow they came back and got to know somebody.
Yeah, it took years for a lot of them, 49, 50, and so forth. The immigration policies were shifting, and so a lot of them were able to come back.
Well, thank you very much for coming, Mr. Kruger. I have a couple questions for you, if you're
Yep.
okay with that.
Go ahead.
So, based on kind of the other two questions asked here, that I might kind of understand what the answer would be. But were there any of the immigrants, the German immigrants that had came to Nebraska in the early 20th century or so? Were they ever put into these prisoners of war camps for their, I don't know, maybe just their heritage or their ethnicity?
It did happen, particularly, of course, the famous is the Japanese Americans that were in prison, but the close relationships, it's why people like Thomas Nagel, who were German immigrants, German Jewish immigrants, were placed in positions in non-combative roles. They saw this as, maybe a safer role for someone that's, ethnically German, born in Germany, immigrated to the United States. Yes, there was lesser camps, but nothing to the extent like Japanese Americans. But they did intern some, particularly on the East Coast, for having too far of Nazi tendencies or maybe being more soon recent immigrants from Germany.
But none were in Nebraska, is that what
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't believe that happening here. They did have rules like no speaking German was one in Grand Island, that you can't speak German anymore at the outbreak of war and so forth. And then, as we saw, most individuals that spoke German would speak German with the POWs and continued on.
Very good. And then my other question, a lot of times people like to compare what the POW camps were like in Japan or in Germany or whatnot, and how different those experiences were. Have you ever, in your research, did a comparison between the two?
There are comparisons, and what it was, the typical norm for most of these camps were much better than all situations, even with Germany and so forth. They even got the nickname. They had to have special investigations on maybe we're treating these POWs too well. And so after the atrocities of the Holocaust and so forth, they started rationing the food more and putting back on water and bread diets. But during the time period for coddling them was a big issue, and they got the nickname the Fritz Ritz, is what these POW camps. So in comparison, they were doing quite well on the camps and so forth. Many POWs wrote about how many pounds they gained by being at these camps, and then all the stuff that they had to carry back with them, and their German uniforms no longer fitting anymore.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
I want to thank our speaker in his presentation today, and thank everyone for being here. How about a round of applause?
Thank you for everything.